The galaxy burned on the night of the Valorian founding anniversary. On 47 worlds across 3 sectors, the client species rose in coordinated rebellion against their masters. The underground, a network that had spent decades planning in shadows and whispers, struck simultaneously at infrastructure hubs, garrison stations, and administrative centers. For one glorious moment, the oppressed believed freedom was within reach. Within 7 days, every single rebellion was crushed. The core empires, the Valorian ascendancy, the Tech Consortium, and the Shren hierarchy, had ruled the galaxy for over 2,000 years. They had perfected the machinery of control. Their warships descended on the rebel worlds with overwhelming force. Orbital bombardments turned resistant strongholds into smoking craters. Ground forces executed thousands in public squares as warnings. The client species learned, once again, that hope was a luxury they could not afford. The Murren returned to their assembly lines. The Dulceth returned to their labor battalions. The Paxi returned to their technical stations. The Underground's leadership was hunted down and killed, their names added to lists of traitors that would follow their families for generations. The galaxy's attention moved on. The rebellion had failed, as all rebellions against the core empires eventually did. Order was restored. The machine of galactic civilization continued its eternal rotation. But on a barely habitable moon-designated Refuge Station, in a worthless system the core empires had never bothered to fully survey, something different happened. Captain Helena Reeves stood in the Colonial Administration Center, watching the reports flood in from across the galaxy. Each one was worse than the last. Massacres on Kelvin 3, mass executions on Thrain, entire city blocks leveled on Mordian Station. She felt each death as a personal failure, though she knew that was irrational. She was just one human on one small colony, light years from the killing fields. Behind her, the representatives of Refuge Station's secret population waited in silence. There were 12,000 of them now, client species who had escaped their bondage over the years and found their way to this remote human settlement. The core empires didn't know they existed. The human colonists had hidden them, fed them, protected them, all while maintaining the fiction that Refuge Station was just another marginal human outpost on a worthless rock. Kale, the Murren who had coordinated the failed revolts from his hidden command post on Refuge Station, stood with his head bowed. His compound eyes, usually so expressive despite their alien structure, seemed dim. He had spent 20 years building the underground. He had believed they could win. Now his network was destroyed, and thousands were dead because of his plans. Beside him, Thorn shifted his massive Dulceth frame. He had been a soldier for the empires once, trained to fight in their wars of expansion. He had deserted 10 years ago when ordered to execute prisoners, and every day since he had waited for the inevitable moment when the empires would find him. That moment, he knew, was coming soon. Siva, the Paxi engineer whose small frame belied her brilliant technical mind, worked quietly at a console. She was monitoring Empire communications, watching their fleets reposition, tracking the trajectory of their vengeance. She had calculated how long they had before the empires discovered Refuge Station's secret. The number was small, very small. Helena turned from the screens and looked at the assembled crowd. 8,000 human colonists, 12,000 refugees. The entirety of Refuge Station's population, crammed into this meeting hall built for a fraction of that number. She had been a military officer once, back on Earth. She had served in the Terrestrial Defense Force for 15 years before accepting the position of Colonial Administrator on Refuge Station. She had thought she was done with war. The galaxy seemed so civilized compared to Earth's bloody history. The core empires maintained order through overwhelming force. Yes, but they followed rules. Conventions. There were boundaries even they observed. Then she had met the client species, seen the brands on their skin marking them as property, heard the stories of families separated, children bred for servitude, entire species reduced to tools. She had realized that the galaxy's civilized order was built on a foundation of institutionalized slavery, dressed up in polite language about client species and mutual obligations. The human colonists had started hiding refugees almost immediately. It began with one Murran who begged them not to report his escape, then a family of Paxi fleeing separation, then more and more, until Refuge Station became something the core empires would never tolerate, a place where the enslaved could be free. "They'll come for us now," Helena said, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "The empires will investigate how the underground coordinated across so many worlds. They'll follow the communications back to us. When they discover what we've been hiding, they will demand we surrender every refugee to face execution." The crowd stirred. Fear rippled through the assembled beings like a physical wave. "We have a choice to make," Helena continued. "We can surrender, turn over our friends, our neighbors, the people we've protected for years, save ourselves by sacrificing them. That is the practical choice, the safe choice." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Or we can stand together, all of us, and tell the core empires that Refuge Station will not comply." The silence that followed was profound. Every being in that hall understood what she was suggesting. War with the core empires was suicide. They had no military, no warships, no defenses. They were a civilian colony on a moon nobody wanted. The empires would crush them as easily as they had crushed the other 47 rebellions. Marcus Webb, chief of security and Helena's oldest friend from their military days, stepped forward. He was a lean man in his 40s with gray threading through his dark hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen combat and survived. "Captain, if I may, those of us who served know what Earth's military taught us. We know how to fight, not in clean, civilized battles with rules and boundaries. We know the other kind, the ugly kind. If we're going to do this, we can make them pay a price they won't forget." Dr. Amira Osman, the colony's chief medical officer, raised her hand. She was a woman in her 30s who had left a comfortable position at a prestigious Earth hospital to come to the frontier. "We have medical supplies, but not enough for a prolonged conflict. We'll need to be realistic about what we can sustain." Jackson Torres, the mining engineer whose crews had bored deep into Refuge Station's crust, spoke up. "The tunnel networks could be expanded. We could go deep, create layers of defense, make them fight for every meter." Around the hall, more humans began speaking up, offering skills, resources, knowledge. Helena watched as her people, who had come to this remote moon seeking peace, began planning for war. Then Kale raised his head. "Why?" His voice was harsh, ground down by grief and failure. "Why would you do this? We failed. 47 worlds all crushed. What makes you think we can succeed where everyone else failed?" Helena looked at the Murran directly. "Because you fought alone on 47 worlds. Here you fight with us, and humans wrote the book on impossible victories." Thorn rumbled a deep sound from his chest. "I have studied human history since coming here. Your species has fought wars that killed millions of your own kind. You have destroyed yourselves repeatedly and somehow survived. Why? How?" Marcus answered before Helena could. "Because we're stubborn, because we're creative, because when we're pushed to the wall, we don't surrender, we bite back. Every client species in this galaxy has been conditioned to submit to superior force. Humans never learned that lesson. We've been fighting each other for thousands of years, and we remember every trick, every tactic, every strategy that works when you're outnumbered and outgunned." He turned to address the entire hall, both human and alien. "The core empires fight civilized wars. They have rules, conventions, boundaries they observe. They think war is a game with acceptable moves and unacceptable ones. But humans come from a world where total war was invented, where enemies burned each other's cities and salted the earth, where desperate people fought occupiers for generations using nothing but improvised weapons and sheer determination. If we're going to stand against the empires, we need to teach you everything we know, everything we learned the hard way." Siva looked up from her console. "The Valorian ascendancy has detected unusual communications patterns. They're dispatching a diplomatic vessel to investigate. It will arrive in 3 days." Helena straightened. "Then we have 3 days to decide who we are, who votes to surrender." Not a single hand rose. "Who votes to stand?" Every hand, human and alien alike, went up. Helena felt something shift in her chest, a weight settling into place. The weight of command in wartime, a burden she had hoped never to carry again. "Then we'd better get to work," The next 3 days passed in a blur of frantic activity. Marcus organized the defense forces, dividing the population into units. The humans with military experience became squad leaders, training the client species in basic combat. It was rushed, chaotic, barely enough to teach them which end of a weapon to point at the enemy. But something remarkable happened during those 3 days. The client species, who had been conditioned from birth to submit, to obey, to accept their place in the hierarchy, began to change. Marcus taught them to move aggressively, to think tactically, to see their bodies as weapons. He taught them that superior force could be overcome with superior strategy, that technology could be negated with terrain and preparation, that the will to fight mattered more than the size of your army. The Murren, with their compound eyes and quick reflexes, became scouts and spotters. The Dulcith, massive and strong, trained in close combat and heavy weapons operation. The Paxi, small and clever, learned demolitions and sabotage. Jackson's mining crews worked around the clock, expanding the tunnel networks that honeycombed Refuge Station's crust. They created hidden supply depots, underground barracks, and escape routes. They rigged collapse points that could seal off sections and trap invaders. They turned their home into a fortress. When the Valorian diplomatic vessel arrived, Helena was ready. She met with Ambassador Korath, a Valorian whose silver skin and elegant bearing spoke of generations of aristocratic breeding, in the Colonial Administration Center. Korath looked around with barely concealed distaste at the crude human architecture. Captain Reeves, the Ascendancy has become aware of concerning reports regarding your colony. We believe you may be harboring fugitive client species. Helena met his gaze without flinching. Refuge Station provides sanctuary to all who seek it. Korath's expression hardened. The beings you are protecting are property of the core empires, registered and tracked. Their presence here is a violation of a dozen treaties. You will surrender them immediately. No, the single word seemed to echo in the room. Korath stared at her as if she had spoken in an unknown language. No, Captain Reeves, you do not seem to understand the gravity of your situation. The Ascendancy does not negotiate with those who harbor fugitives. Surrender them within 48 hours or face military action. Helena stood. Ambassador, let me be very clear. Refuge Station will not surrender sentient beings to slavery. We will not comply. If the core empires wish to test our resolve, you are welcome to try. She gestured to Siva, who activated the communications array. Helena's next words were broadcast not just to the Valorian vessel, but to every system within range, to Earth, to the client species worlds, to the entire galaxy. This is Captain Helena Reeves of Refuge Station. The core empires have demanded we turn over 12,000 refugees who sought sanctuary on our world. We refuse. These are sentient beings with the same right to freedom as any other. If the empires choose to attack us for protecting them, then let the galaxy see who the real criminals are. Korath left without another word. Helena knew she had just signed Refuge Station's death warrant, but she also knew that every client species in the galaxy would hear her words. Every slave would know that somewhere, someone had said no. The response from Earth came within hours. The official government statement was carefully worded condemnation of Refuge Station's actions, calling them reckless and unauthorized. But Helena had expected that. Earth's government had to maintain diplomatic relations with the core empires. They couldn't officially support what Refuge Station was doing, but the unofficial response was something else entirely. Within 24 hours, ships began arriving. Not military vessels, Earth couldn't send those without declaring war, but private ships. Volunteer transports, freighters carrying weapons, supplies, and people, lots of people. They came from across Earth systems, retired military personnel who had served in the terrestrial defense force, engineers who wanted to help fortify the colony, doctors who knew they would be needed, and fighters, people who believed that some principles were worth dying for. By the end of the first week, Refuge Station's population had swelled by another 3,000 humans. Marcus found himself commanding not a ragtag civilian militia, but a real fighting force with actual military experience. They brought weapons, equipment, and most importantly, knowledge. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka arrived on the third day, a compact woman in her late 20s with sharp eyes and a reputation for unconventional tactics. She had resigned her commission in Earth's Navy to come to Refuge Station, bringing with her a dozen other junior officers who felt the same. She took one look at the defensive preparations and immediately began improving them. "You're thinking too conventionally," she told Marcus as they surveyed the tunnel networks. "The empires will expect defensive positions, fallback points, standard siege warfare. We need to make them afraid to enter our tunnels. We need to make every step forward cost them blood." She introduced concepts like kill zones, where attackers would be funneled into areas with overlapping fields of fire. Ambush points that could be triggered and then abandoned. False positions that would draw fire while the real defenders attacked from unexpected angles. Tunnel sections that could be flooded, collapsed, or filled with toxic gas at a moment's notice. The client species watched and learned. Kale, working with the human tactical officers, began to see warfare in a completely different way. The underground had always thought in terms of striking targets and then fleeing, hoping to avoid direct confrontation with Empire forces. The humans taught a different philosophy. Make the enemy come to you, force them to fight on your terms, use their strengths against them. Thorne trained with the human close combat instructors and discovered that his size, always used by the empires to make him an expendable shock trooper, could be an advantage when combined with proper technique. He learned how to use confined spaces to negate numerical superiority, how to break formations and create chaos, how to turn his body into a weapon that could punch through armor. Siva worked with Jackson's engineers to create improvised weapons that the empires had never encountered. Mining charges were repurposed into shaped charges that could punch through armored vehicles. Drilling equipment became the basis for makeshift artillery. Chemical compounds used in ore processing were weaponized in ways that made Dr. Osman wince but nod in approval. The colonists who had come to Refuge Station seeking a quiet life found themselves doing things they had never imagined. Teachers became ammunition manufacturers. Farmers became tunnel fighters. Artists created camouflage patterns and deception measures. Everyone contributed because everyone understood that if Refuge Station fell, they all fell together. Helena spent her days coordinating preparations and her nights watching the tactical displays, waiting for the inevitable. The Valorian ascendancy would not accept this defiance. They would send a fleet, and that fleet would attempt to crush Refuge Station as an example to any other worlds that might consider harboring fugitives. The only question was how big the fleet would be. The answer came 30 days after Ambassador Korath's departure. Siva's sensors detected the fleet emerging from FTL at the system's edge. She ran the numbers twice, hoping she had made an error. 12 warships, she reported, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. 3,000 soldiers, orbital bombardment capability. They'll be in weapons range in 6 hours. Helena assembled her command staff. Marcus, Yuki, Jackson, Amira, and the client species leaders, Kale, Thorne, and Siva. They gathered around the tactical display showing the approaching fleet. "We can't win a space battle," Yuki said bluntly. "We have no warships, no orbital defenses. They'll establish space superiority immediately." "We have cargo ships," Jackson suggested. "Mining vessels with powerful engines." Yuki's eyes lit up. "Kamikaze attacks. Load them with mining charges and ram the Empire ships." Amira looked horrified. "That's suicide." "We'll need volunteers," Helena said quietly. "People willing to pilot the ships on one-way trips." Marcus nodded. "I'll ask for volunteers. You'd be surprised how many people are willing to die if they know it matters." He was right. Within an hour, they had more volunteers than ships. Retired pilots, young hotshots looking for glory, and client species who wanted to strike back at their former masters. Helena approved 15 ships for the suicide runs, knowing that each one represented lives she was sending to their deaths. The fleet commander, Admiral Voth, broadcast his final demand as his ships entered weapons range: surrender immediately or be destroyed. Helena's response was broadcast across all frequencies: "You were warned. Since you've chosen war, let us show you how it's done." The first phase of the battle was brief and brutal. The 15 cargo ships, loaded with mining charges and piloted by volunteers, accelerated toward the Valorian fleet at maximum burn. The Empire warships, designed to fight other warships in clean fleet engagements, found themselves facing an attack they had never anticipated. 3 ships made it through the defensive fire. One rammed a destroyer amidships, the mining charges detonating with enough force to split the vessel in two. Another clipped a cruiser, tearing away its main gun batteries. The third crashed into a troop transport, killing hundreds of soldiers before they could even reach the planet. The remaining cargo ships were destroyed, but they had accomplished their mission. The Valorian fleet was hurt, confused, and angry. Admiral Voth ordered an immediate ground assault, determined to crush this upstart colony quickly and decisively. The troop transports descended toward Refuge Station's surface. 3,000 Valorian soldiers in full combat armor, equipped with the best weapons and equipment the core empires could provide. They expected resistance, but nothing they couldn't handle. They were professional soldiers. The colonists below were civilians playing at war. They learned differently when the first transport landed in the designated zone and immediately triggered a series of mining charges that Jackson's crews had buried throughout the landing area. The explosions tore through the transport's lightly armored belly, killing dozens. The soldiers who survived stumbled out into a killing field. Hidden positions opened fire from 3 directions simultaneously. The Valorian soldiers, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves in a nightmare of ambushes and booby traps. Every position they tried to secure had been pre-targeted. Every approach was covered by overlapping fire, and the enemy refused to stay and fight. They struck and vanished into tunnels that seemed to go everywhere and nowhere. Thorn led a squad of Dulceth fighters in a counterattack against a Valorian command post. They emerged from a tunnel entrance that the Empires hadn't detected, crashed into the rear of the position with devastating force, and disappeared back underground before reinforcements could arrive. The Valorian commander was captured, along with critical communications equipment. Kale coordinated the defense from a command center deep underground, using the tunnel networks to move forces where they were needed. The humans had taught him to think of the battlefield as a fluid space where mobility and knowledge were more important than raw firepower. He could see the entire battle unfolding on his displays, fed by sensors the Paxi engineers had scattered across the colony. The Valorian soldiers advanced slowly, taking massive casualties for every meter gained. They were better equipped, better trained, and had overwhelming numerical superiority. But they were fighting an enemy that didn't play by the rules. An enemy that used suicide bombers, improvised explosives, and tactics that no civilized species would employ. Lieutenant Tanaka led a strike team through the tunnel networks, navigating by maps that only the defenders possessed. They emerged behind Valorian lines and began systematically destroying supply depots, communications relays, and medical stations. The attacks seemed random and disjointed, but they were carefully planned to create maximum disruption. The Valorian commanders found themselves fighting not just the enemy in front of them, but an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. After 8 hours of brutal combat, Admiral Voth prepared to use his trump card. If the ground forces couldn't win, he would use orbital bombardment to simply destroy the colony from space. Every building, every tunnel entrance, every defensive position would be reduced to rubble. That's when Yuki's gambit paid off. Her strike team had navigated through the deepest tunnels, emerged 3 kilometers behind the Valorian lines, and seized the landing zone. More importantly, they had captured the Valorian ground commander and 200 soldiers who had been held in reserve. Helena broadcast a message to Admiral Voth's flagship. "Admiral, we have your ground commander. If you begin orbital bombardment, he dies, along with 200 of your soldiers. Withdraw your fleet or watch your people die." The communication went silent for a long moment. Helena could imagine the calculations running through Voth's mind. In civilized warfare, this didn't happen. Hostages were exchanged, prisoners were treated with respect, and there were conventions that even enemies observed. The humans weren't following any conventions. Voth's response came cold and hard. You would execute prisoners of war. Admiral, there are no prisoners of war here. There are only people fighting for their freedom and people trying to enslave them. Choose. Another long silence. Then Voth spoke again, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. We withdraw, but this is not over. The core empires will return with a force you cannot resist. You have won nothing but a temporary reprieve. The Valorian fleet broke orbit and jumped to FTL, leaving behind their ground forces to be captured or killed. Helena ordered all captured soldiers to be treated according to Earth military conventions: medical care, food, shelter. The Valorians seemed shocked by this treatment, having expected execution. The battle was over. Refuge Station had survived barely. The final count was devastating: 400 humans dead, 800 client species dead, colony infrastructure 40% destroyed. The wounded numbered in the thousands. Dr. Osman and her medical teams worked for 72 hours straight, performing triage in makeshift hospitals that had once been warehouses and living quarters. Helena walked through the devastated colony, seeing the cost of their victory. Buildings reduced to rubble. Tunnel entrances collapsed by orbital bombardment. Bodies waiting to be identified and buried. She had known command in wartime before, had ordered people to their deaths, but this was different. These were not soldiers who had signed up for war. These were civilians, refugees, people who had come seeking peace. Marcus found her standing at the central memorial where they had begun posting the names of the dead. We held, he said simply. At what cost? At the cost of proving it could be done. Every client species in the galaxy will have heard about this by now. They'll know that the core empires can be fought. That superior force can be overcome. Helena turned to him. The empires will come back. With more ships, more soldiers. We can't hold against that. Maybe not, but we bought time. And time is what Earth needs to decide who we really are. He was right. Across human space, Refuge Station's stand had ignited a firestorm of debate. The official government position remained cautious, but public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive. Protests erupted on Earth demanding action. Military personnel resigned their commissions to volunteer for Refuge Station. Supply ships streamed toward the colony carrying everything from medical supplies to weapons. More importantly, the client species had taken notice. On a dozen worlds, underground networks began reforming. Escaped slaves who had been hiding in fear started organizing. The underground, declared dead after the failed revolts, was being reborn. And the core empires, for the first time in 2,000 years, felt something they had not experienced before: uncertainty. The emergency meeting of the three core empires took place on neutral ground, a diplomatic station that had hosted treaties and negotiations for centuries. Representatives of the Valorian ascendancy, the Tech Consortium, and the Shren hierarchy gathered in a chamber designed to project power and permanence. High Counselor Thorax of the Valorian ascendancy spoke first, his silver skin gleaming under the chamber's lights. Refuge Station must be destroyed, not just defeated, annihilated. Every human and client species there must be killed as an example. Consortium Director Melk, a tech whose chitinous form towered over the others, clicked his mandibles in agreement. The footage from the battle has spread across every network. Client species everywhere have seen that the empires can be resisted. This is an existential threat to our entire system of order. Hierarchy Eldest Shren, whose species communicated through pheromones translated by sophisticated equipment, added her voice. We must assemble overwhelming force, not just military, economic, diplomatic, political. Humanity must be isolated, contained, and if necessary, eliminated as a galactic presence. Thorax nodded. We will gather 50 warships and 20,000 soldiers. This time there will be no negotiation, no opportunity for surrender. We will siege Refuge Station until every defender is dead, and then we will do the same to any human colony that harbors client species. The other two representatives signaled agreement. The decision was made. The core empires would return to Refuge Station with a force designed not just to win, but to make an example so terrifying that no one would ever dare resist again. On Earth, the government found itself caught between two impossible pressures. The core empires had delivered an ultimatum: disavow Refuge Station and hand over Captain Helena Reeves for trial, or face economic sanctions and possible military action. Earth's economy depended on trade with the core empires. Their technology, resources, and markets were woven through human civilization, but Earth's population wouldn't allow capitulation. In every major city, protests filled the streets. Veterans organizations demanded military support for Refuge Station. Media coverage showed endless footage of the battle, of humans and client species fighting together, of a small colony standing against an empire. Secretary General Williams addressed Earth's population in a carefully worded statement. "We will not abandon our people." Refuge Station acted outside official authority, but they acted according to principles that humanity holds sacred. "We will not hand Captain Reeves or any other human over to the core empires. If that means sanctions, we will endure them. If it means something worse, we will face it together." It was as close to a declaration of war as Earth could make without actually declaring war. The government began quietly mobilizing military forces, calling up reserves, and accelerating weapons production. If the core empires attacked Refuge Station again, Earth would respond. The question was whether humanity's relatively small military could stand against forces that had ruled the galaxy for millennia. On Refuge Station, preparations for the next assault intensified. The volunteers who had arrived after the first battle brought not just numbers but expertise. Real military equipment replaced improvised weapons. The tunnel networks expanded deeper and more elaborate. The wounded were evacuated to ships in orbit, while fresh fighters arrived to replace them. Kale found himself in an unexpected role, training other client species in human military tactics. Representatives from a dozen worlds had made secret journeys to Refuge Station, seeking to learn what the underground here had learned. He taught them everything: small unit tactics, improvised weapons, psychological warfare, asymmetric strategies. "The key," he explained to a group of Murran students, "is understanding that the empires have conditioned us to see ourselves as inferior. They have convinced us that their technology, their numbers, their experience make them invincible. But the humans taught me that none of that matters as much as will. If you are willing to pay any price, endure any sacrifice, fight with absolute determination, you can defeat any enemy." Thorn had become something of a legend among the client species, a Dulceth who had refused to serve the empires and now fought against them. His story spread across secret networks, inspiring others. He received messages from Dulceth soldiers across the galaxy, some asking for advice, others simply wanting to know that resistance was possible. He recorded a message that was broadcast through underground channels, speaking directly to his people. "I was a slave soldier. I killed for the empires because I believed I had no choice. But there is always a choice. I chose freedom, and I found humans who were willing to fight beside me. If a coward like me can stand against the empires, so can you." Siva worked with Earth engineers to create a network of sensors and communications relays that extended beyond Refuge Station. They needed early warning of the next assault, needed to know when and how the empires would strike. The network was crude by empire standards, but it was redundant and distributed, nearly impossible to completely destroy. She also worked on something else, a way to broadcast everything that happened on Refuge Station to the entire galaxy in real time. If the empires destroyed them, every species everywhere would see exactly what happened. The core empires relied on controlling information, on managing their image as benevolent rulers maintaining order. Siva intended to strip away that facade and show the galaxy what their order really meant. Helena spent her days managing the overwhelming logistics of a colony preparing for siege, and her nights writing reports for Earth. She documented everything: the tactics that worked, the mistakes they made, the lessons learned. If Refuge Station fell, she wanted humanity to know exactly how to fight the core empires. Her reports became training manuals, circulated through Earth's military and then leaked to the public. She also wrote personal messages to the colonists who had died, sending them to their families on Earth. She felt she owed them that much. Each message was a small eulogy, a record of how they had died and why. Some families responded with anger, blaming her for their losses. Others sent messages of support, saying their loved ones had died for something that mattered. She read all of them and carried the weight of every death. Marcus trained a new generation of guerrilla fighters, knowing that most of them would die in the coming battle. He was honest about the odds, about what they faced, about what war really meant. Some left, unable to face what was coming. Most stayed. He ran them through scenarios, pushed them to their limits, and taught them the most important lesson he knew. In war, survival often came down to simple things. Stay low, move fast, watch your corners, trust your squad. The complicated tactics and strategies mattered, but in the moment of combat, it was the simple things that kept you alive. Lieutenant Tanaka expanded the defensive preparations, adding layers and redundancies. She created false positions that would draw fire, secret passages that allowed rapid redeployment, and kill zones that could be activated in sequence to channel attackers into predetermined paths. She thought of the colony as a puzzle the enemy would try to solve, and she kept changing the puzzle so the solution would never quite work. She also trained strike teams for offensive operations. If the empires established a siege, they would need to disrupt it, attack supply lines, and keep the enemy off balance. She selected volunteers for suicide missions, knowing that most would not return, and was continually amazed by how many stepped forward. Weeks turned into months as Refuge Station prepared for the inevitable. The core empires were gathering their fleet, assembling forces from across their territories. Intelligence reports suggested the assault would come with overwhelming force, designed to crush any resistance quickly. But something else was happening across the galaxy. On Kelvin 3, where the first rebellion had been crushed, a new uprising began. It was smaller, more cautious, but it used tactics that had worked on Refuge Station. On Thrain, saboteurs destroyed an Empire military depot using improvised explosives identical to those designed by Paxi engineers on Refuge Station. On a dozen other worlds, client species who had been cowed into submission began resisting again. The core empires found themselves fighting not one problem but many. Resources had to be diverted to pacification operations. Ships that were supposed to join the assault on Refuge Station were redirected to other trouble spots. The underground was reforming faster than the empires could crush it, and this time it had knowledge, tactics, and inspiration from a small colony that had proven resistance was possible. 6 months after the first battle, Siva's sensors detected the approaching fleet. It was as massive as intelligence had predicted. 50 warships, transports carrying 20,000 soldiers, siege equipment designed to crack fortifications that would make Refuge Station's defenses look primitive. Helena assembled the defenders one final time. The population had swelled to 30,000, humans and client species together, all willing to fight. She looked at the assembled faces and felt a profound sense of pride mixed with grief. So many would die in the coming weeks. "The core empires are coming," she said simply. "They intend to destroy us completely, to make an example so terrifying that no one will ever resist them again. They want to prove that freedom is impossible, that resistance is futile, that their order is permanent." She paused, meeting eyes throughout the crowd. "They're wrong. We've already proven them wrong. Every day we stand here free, we prove them wrong. Every client species that sees us and takes hope, we prove them wrong. Whatever happens in the coming battle, the core empires have already lost the only thing that really matters, the certainty that they cannot be defeated." Marcus stepped forward. "We're not going to lie to you. Most of us won't survive this. The odds are overwhelmingly against us, but we're going to make them pay for every meter of ground. We're going to show them that free people fight differently than slaves. And we're going to make sure the entire galaxy sees what happens when empires built on slavery face people willing to die for freedom." The fleet arrived and immediately established a blockade. No ships in or out. Admiral Voth commanded again, determined to redeem his earlier failure. His first action was systematic orbital bombardment of military targets, softening defenses before the ground assault. Refuge Station's surface was pounded by weapons that could crack mountains. Defensive positions were reduced to craters. Tunnel entrances collapsed. The bombardment continued for a week, relentless and devastating. The defenders huddled in the deepest tunnels, listening to the thunder of destruction above, waiting for it to end. When it finally did, 20,000 Empire soldiers landed and began their systematic advance. This time, they moved slowly, carefully, using overwhelming firepower to clear every position. They learned from their previous mistakes, advancing in coordinated formations with proper support. The defenders fought for every meter. Ambushes, booby traps, snipers, and suicide attacks slowed the advance to a crawl. But they were being pushed back steadily, compressed into an ever-shrinking defensive perimeter. The Empire soldiers paid in blood for every tunnel, every room, every corridor, but they kept coming. Week 2 of the siege saw the defenders compressed into 60% of the colony. Casualties mounted on both sides. Dr. Osmond's medical facilities were overwhelmed, operating theaters running constantly, hallways filled with wounded waiting for treatment. Supplies began running low. Ammunition was rationed. Food stores were carefully managed. Kale coordinated the defense from a command center that had been moved 3 times as the Empires advanced. He watched his tactical displays show the defensive perimeter shrinking and knew they were running out of options. The humans had taught him how to fight, but even the best tactics couldn't overcome such overwhelming force forever. Thorn led a squad in a desperate counterattack against an Empire strongpoint, buying time for civilians to evacuate through the tunnels. His team succeeded in destroying the position, but took 70% casualties. Thorn himself survived, though barely, carried back to the medical center with severe injuries. He refused treatment until others had been seen to, sitting against a wall and watching the endless stream of wounded. Marcus organized the defensive fallbacks. Each one planned to extract maximum cost from the attackers. He rotated units to give exhausted fighters brief rest periods, knowing that fatigue was as dangerous as enemy fire. He visited positions throughout the defensive line, offering encouragement and tactical advice, always calm even as the situation grew more desperate. Yuki's strike teams continued their guerrilla operations, attacking supply lines and command posts behind Empire lines. They operated on minimal sleep, conducting raids and then vanishing back into tunnels the Empires hadn't mapped. Her teams took terrible casualties, but they kept the enemy off balance, forcing them to divert forces to rear security. By week 3, the defenders were compressed into the final 20% of the colony. The Empire commander broadcast an offer: surrender now, and only the human leaders would be executed. All others would face slavery rather than death. Fight on, and everyone would die. Helena called a meeting of all remaining fighters who could be spared from the defensive line. They gathered in what had been a storage cavern, now serving as a final command center. She looked at the exhausted, injured, desperate faces around her. The Empires have offered terms. Surrender, and most of you will live as slaves. Fight, and we all die here. Silence filled the cavern. Then Kale spoke, his voice stronger than it had been in months. I spent my life as a slave. I would rather die free than live another day in chains. Around the cavern, others echoed the sentiment. Client species who had tasted freedom, humans who believed some principles were worth dying for. The vote was unanimous. They would fight to the end. Marcus volunteered to lead a final desperate attack, a suicide mission to destroy the Empire command post. If they could kill the enemy commanders, it might buy enough chaos for some defenders to escape through the deepest tunnels. 50 volunteers stepped forward, humans and client species together. They armed themselves with every weapon and explosive they could carry, knowing none of them would return. They launched their attack at dawn of the 22nd day of siege. 50 fighters against thousands, attacking directly into the heart of Empire positions. It was madness, suicide, and absolutely necessary. They fought with the desperation of people who had nothing left to lose, punching through Empire lines and driving toward the command center. The Empire forces reacted with shock and then overwhelming counterattack. The 50 were surrounded, cut off, fighting in an ever-shrinking circle. Marcus took a round through his shoulder but kept fighting, watching his people die around him. They were 100 meters from the command post when the Empire forces finally overwhelmed their position. And then the sky changed. New ships emerged from FTL at the system's edge. Not Empire ships, human ships, 20 warships of Earth's fleet, along with hundreds of armed civilian vessels. The entire military space force that humanity possessed, arriving at exactly the moment when Refuge Station's last defenders were about to be annihilated. Admiral James Harding commanded Earth's fleet from the battleship Indomitable. He was a career officer who had fought in Earth's last major war, a gray-haired veteran who understood that sometimes principles mattered more than pragmatic calculation. He had resigned his commission rather than follow Earth government orders to stay out of the conflict. Half of Earth's officer corps had done the same. The government, faced with a mutinous military and overwhelming public pressure, had finally authorized the operation. Harding broadcast on all frequencies as his fleet entered the system. This is Earth's fleet to all Empire forces. You are ordered to cease hostilities immediately and withdraw from Refuge Station. This is your only warning. Admiral Voth responded with cold fury. Earth fleet, you are outnumbered and outgunned. Your interference will only result in the destruction of your ships along with the rebels you seek to protect. Withdraw now. Harding's response was blunt. Admiral, humanity has a word for the kind of victory where you win but pay such a terrible price that the victory is worthless. We call it Pyrrhic. If you remain in this system, we will show you exactly what that means. We will ram your ships. We will use suicide attacks. We will make you pay for every meter of space in blood until your fleet is crippled even if ours is destroyed. And then every human colony in this galaxy will know exactly how to fight you. Your choice, withdraw, or learn why humanity has spent thousands of years perfecting the art of mutually assured destruction. It was a bluff, but only partially. Harding's ships were outnumbered, but they were crewed by people willing to die. The Empire fleet had already taken casualties from the siege, was low on supplies, and had spent 3 weeks in brutal ground combat. Most importantly, every moment this standoff continued, more footage spread across the galaxy of the core empires using overwhelming force against refugees seeking freedom. On the ground, Marcus and his surviving strike team, down to 15 fighters, heard the broadcast. They were surrounded, wounded, nearly out of ammunition. But the Empire troops surrounding them had stopped firing, confused by the fleet engagement above. Voth found himself in an impossible situation. His fleet could probably defeat Earth's, but it would cost him ships, time, and lives. The ground campaign had already taken far longer and cost far more than projected. Footage of the siege was spreading despite communications jamming, showing the galaxy exactly what happened when the core empires decided to make an example. Worse, intelligence reports indicated that client species revolts were accelerating across Empire space. Resources were desperately needed elsewhere. The pacification of Refuge Station, meant to terrify potential rebels into submission, had instead inspired them. Every day the siege continued, the situation deteriorated, and there was a deeper calculation. If Voth destroyed Earth's fleet here, it meant total war with humanity, a species that had just demonstrated they were willing to fight with tactics no civilized race would employ, a species that seemed to relish the idea of mutually assured destruction. A species that, if pushed to desperation, might do unthinkable things. The core empires had ruled through overwhelming force for 2,000 years. They had crushed every rebellion, intimidated every potential threat, maintained order through the certainty that resistance was futile. But certainty required that victories be clean, decisive, and relatively cheap. What was happening at Refuge Station was none of those things. After an hour of tense standoff, Voth signaled for negotiations. A ceasefire was arranged. Empire forces would withdraw from Refuge Station. Earth would agree not to arm client species on Empire worlds, a promise both sides knew was meaningless, but allowed everyone to save face. The siege was over. The Empire troops withdrew, carrying their wounded and leaving behind the positions they had fought weeks to capture. Marcus and his surviving strike team were recovered by Refuge Station defenders, more dead than alive, but alive nonetheless. The colony emerged from its tunnels to survey the devastation. The surface of Refuge Station looked like the surface of a moon that had been used for target practice. Craters overlapped craters, Buildings were reduced to rubble. Infrastructure was shattered, but the tunnels remained and the people remained and they had survived. The final count was devastating. 2,400 humans dead, 4,000 client species dead, over half the colony infrastructure destroyed. But Refuge Station still stood, and that was a victory the galaxy could not ignore. The aftermath spread across human and Empire space like a shockwave. On Earth, the returning fleet was greeted as heroes. The government, which had reluctantly authorized the operation only after the military threatened mutiny, now claimed credit for the bold action. Secretary General Williams gave speeches about humanity's commitment to freedom and justice. More importantly, volunteers flooded toward Refuge Station. Engineers to rebuild, doctors to treat the wounded, colonists to replace those who had died. Within months, Refuge Station's population exceeded its pre-siege numbers. It became a symbol, the place where humanity had said no to the core empires and survived. For the client species, the impact was even more profound. Within 6 months of Refuge Station's survival, 15 worlds successfully rebelled against core empire control. The underground reformed with human advisors, human tactics, and human weapons quietly supplied despite the treaty. The core empires found themselves fighting not one conflict but dozens, stretching their forces thin and making the cost of maintaining their order increasingly expensive. The three core empires met again in emergency session, facing a crisis unlike anything in their 2,000-year reign. The client species were no longer reliable. Revolts erupted constantly. Human advisors seemed to be everywhere, teaching resistance tactics and asymmetric warfare. The galactic order they had maintained through overwhelming force was unraveling. High Counselor Thorax spoke with barely controlled fury. This is an existential threat. If we cannot maintain control of the client species, our entire civilization collapses. We need them for labor, for military service, for the functioning of our economy. Consortium Director Melk clicked his mandibles in agreement. But the cost of pacification grows daily. We have diverted 40% of our military to suppression operations. Our economy is suffering, and every harsh response generates more resistance. Hierarchy Eldest Shren added the critical observation. The humans have taught the client species something we cannot unteach. That resistance is possible. That freedom can be won. That determination and sacrifice can overcome superior force. We cannot defeat an idea with warships. The meeting concluded with no clear resolution. The core empires began exploring options ranging from negotiated autonomy for client species to increased automation to reduce dependence on them. But the fundamental equation had changed. The certainty that had maintained their power for millennia was gone, replaced by constant calculation and uncertainty. On Refuge Station, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. The rubble was cleared. Buildings were rebuilt. The tunnel networks which had saved them were expanded and improved. The colony became not just a settlement but a training ground, where client species from across the galaxy came to learn human tactics and methods. Helena Reeves, now known across the galaxy, remained as governor. She had aged visibly during the siege, gray streaking through her hair, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She carried the weight of every death, but she also carried the pride of what they had accomplished. Marcus Webb recovered from his injuries, though his shoulder never quite worked properly again. He continued training fighters, now with resources and support from Earth's military. Former Empire soldiers, escaped slaves, and young idealists came to learn from the man who had led the defense of Refuge Station. He taught them everything he knew, always emphasizing that tactics and weapons mattered less than the will to fight. Kale became the public face of the reformed underground, coordinating resistance across dozens of worlds. He traveled constantly, always in danger, meeting with resistance leaders and helping plan operations. He had transformed from a defeated rebel into a symbol of successful resistance. When he spoke, client species across the galaxy listened. Thorn returned to his homeworld 8 months after the siege, leading a rebellion that succeeded in overthrowing Empire control. He became a legend among the Dulceth, proof that their species could be more than slave soldiers. Other Dulcath worlds followed his example, and within a year, half the Dulcath population was in open revolt. Siva continued her technical work, now leading a network of Paxi engineers who sabotaged Empire infrastructure across the galaxy. She developed new methods for disrupting communications, disabling weapons systems, and creating improvised explosives from civilian materials. Her technical manuals were distributed through underground networks, teaching a generation of rebels the art of technological resistance. Lieutenant Tanaka remained on Refuge Station, serving as the colony's military commander. She expanded the defensive preparations, turned the colony into a fortress that could withstand any assault, and trained new generations of fighters. She also fell in love with a Muran engineer, proving that some bonds transcended species. Dr. Osman rebuilt the medical facilities and established a training program for combat medics. Client species from across the galaxy came to study under her, learning not just medicine but the philosophy that every life mattered, that even in war there were ethical boundaries that should not be crossed. Her students carried those lessons back to their worlds, changing how the underground operated. Jackson Torres led the reconstruction efforts, turning Refuge Station into a model of what a free society could be. Humans and client species lived and worked together as equals, sharing resources and responsibilities. It wasn't perfect. There were tensions, misunderstandings, and conflicts, but it proved that different species could coexist without hierarchy and domination. 1 year after the siege, a memorial was dedicated at the center of Refuge Station. It listed the names of all who had died, human and alien together, no distinction between them. Helena spoke at the dedication, her words broadcast across the galaxy. We stand here because thousands gave their lives for a simple idea, that all sentient beings deserve freedom. The core empires believed that order required hierarchy, that civilization required some to rule and others to serve. We proved them wrong. We proved that free people, fighting together for something they believe in, can overcome any force. This memorial reminds us of the cost of that proof. May we never forget what was paid here. The broadcast reached billions across the galaxy. On Empire worlds, client species watched and wept. On free worlds, celebrations erupted. On Earth, humanity recognized that they had stepped onto a path from which there was no turning back. They were no longer neutral observers of galactic politics. They were active participants, aligned firmly on the side of freedom against tyranny. 3 months after the memorial dedication, a delegation arrived at Refuge Station from Korath, a client species world in Empire space. They had successfully rebelled and held their independence for 6 months, but now faced a major Empire counterattack. They came seeking help, advice, and support. Helena met with the delegation leaders in the rebuilt Colonial Administration Center. They explained their situation, their limited resources, their desperate need for assistance. She listened, asked questions, and then looked at her command staff gathered around the table. Marcus spoke first. "We can send advisors, people who know how to fight, how to organize resistance, how to turn a population into an army." Yuki added, "We can provide tactical support, help them prepare their defenses. The empires will make an example of them if we don't help." Kale, attending via hologram from another system, said, "The underground can supply weapons, equipment, and volunteers, but the decision must be yours, Captain. If we help them, the empires will see it as an act of war." Helena looked at each face around the table, seeing the determination in their eyes. She thought of the 2,400 humans and 4,000 client species who had died defending Refuge Station. She thought of the billions still living under Empire rule, waiting for hope. She turned to the delegation. "Refuge Station will help you. We'll send advisors, supplies, and whatever support we can provide. But understand, you're not just fighting for your world. You're fighting for every world that wants to be free. The empires will test you, push you, try to break you. You need to be ready to pay any price." The delegation leader, a being whose species had been enslaved for 800 years, met her eyes. "We are ready. You showed us it was possible. Now show us how it's done." Helena smiled, feeling the weight of command settle once more on her shoulders. She looked at Marcus, saw his slight nod of understanding. They were doing this again, And again, for as long as it took. Let's show them how it's done. 6 months later, Korath successfully repelled the Empire counterattack using tactics learned from Refuge Station. 2 months after that, 3 more worlds requested assistance, then 5, then a dozen. Refuge Station became the center of a network supporting resistance movements across Empire space. The core empires found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't defeat, not because they lacked military power, but because the enemy was an idea. The idea that freedom was worth fighting for. That dignity mattered more than security. That living free was better than surviving as a slave. Humanity had given the galaxy that idea, along with the practical knowledge of how to make it reality. Human advisors spread across rebel worlds. Human tactics became standard for underground operations. Human weapons, often improvised and crude but effective, armed client species fighters. Most importantly, humanity offered something the core empires never could: the belief that ordinary people fighting together could change the galaxy. The slave revolts had failed on 47 worlds, but on one world, the one with humans, it had succeeded. And that single success changed everything. 2 years after the Refuge Station siege, the core empires began negotiating autonomy agreements with client species worlds. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was more than slavery. The negotiations were grudging, forced by military necessity and economic calculation, but they represented the first crack in a system that had stood for 2,000 years. Helena Reeves, now in her 50s and showing the wear of constant struggle, watched the news reports with cautious optimism. The war wasn't over. It would probably never be fully over, but the momentum had shifted. The question was no longer whether the client species could be free, but how long it would take. She stood at the memorial as she did most evenings, reading the names carved into stone. So many dead, so much sacrifice. But because of them, billions across the galaxy lived with hope instead of despair. Marcus joined her, moving more stiffly now, his injuries from the siege never fully healed. They stood together in silence, 2 old soldiers who had survived when so many hadn't. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Helena asked quietly. Marcus considered the question. "I think we did the human thing. We saw people suffering and couldn't look away. We saw injustice and had to fight it. Maybe that's our gift to the galaxy, or our curse. We can't leave well enough alone." Helena smiled slightly. "The galaxy will never be the same." "No," Marcus agreed, "and that's probably for the best." They stood together as night fell over Refuge Station, watching lights come on across the rebuilt colony. Humans and client species moving through streets, living their lives in freedom. It was imperfect, complicated, and sometimes difficult, but it was theirs. The slave revolt had failed everywhere except one planet, the one with humans. And from that single success, the entire galaxy was learning a lesson the core empires had tried to suppress for millennia: that freedom, once tasted, could never be forgotten. And people who had tasted freedom would fight for it with everything they had. Humanity had shown them how, and the galaxy would never forget.